92nd Street Y online media is made possible by the generous support of listeners like you. This program, part of the Unterberg Poetry Center's 75 at 75 project, features Seamus Heaney reading from his work. It was recorded on March 22nd, 1971, before a live audience at New York's 92nd Street Y.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very pleased with the density of the introduction, and I mean it. And I just hope that the density of the reading matches it. It's a pleasure to be reading here at the Y, and it's a pleasure to be reading to everybody, and especially to a number of people who I know are here. Last place I ever expected to be was standing in New York with a book of poems in front of me and an audience of people that never saw me before, or at least most of them. So I'd like to begin with a poem which is really an act of gratitude for whatever poems have come. It's called Personal Helicon, and Helicon, as you know, was that region of Parnassus where the springs came up, and if you drank from those springs, as a poet, you were inspired for life. My springs are less ennobled, perhaps, but I have a feeling, in a humble way, quite ennobling themselves. So, Personal Helicon. As a child, they couldn't keep me from wells and old pumps with buckets and windlasses. I loved the dark drop, the trapped sky, the smells of waterweed, fungus, and dank moss. One in a brickyard with a rotted board top, I savoured the rich crash when a bucket plummeted down at the end of a rope, so deep you saw no reflection in it. A shallow one under a dry stone ditch, fructified like any aquarium. When you dragged out long roots from the soft mulch, a white face hovered over the bottom. Others had echoes, gave back your own call with a clean new music in it. And one was scarcesome, for there, out of ferns and tall foxgloves, a rat slapped across my reflection. Now to pry into roots, to finger slime, to stare big-eyed Narcissus into some spring is beneath all adult dignity. I rhyme to see myself, to set the darkness echoing. There was an inspired misprint in that poem when it came about first. The phrase big-eyed Narcissus, you'll be glad to hear, was printed bog-eyed Narcissus, which was a total invitation. I'd like to follow that with another poem which is watery and about the notion of art or writing or whatever. It's about a water diviner. And it was a source of some satisfaction to me to discover that after the poem had been written, that the Encyclopedia Britannica is quite skeptical about water divining. Although, in fact, it says in a curious, wobbling, concluding paragraph that indeed it seems as if people have found springs, but they shouldn't have in a way. It shouldn't have been possible. Yeah. This poem is about gift, and a friend of mine told me once I had a gift for the maladroit. Anyway, the diviner. The diviner is an image to me of discovery, of gift, of the nonchalant exercise of gift, of the artist as complete romantic, of someone who needs not worry about technique to arrive at the core and root of what he has to find. And the diviner that I remember could share his gift or power or whatever you want to call it by a laying on of hands, in a way. It could make you feel water, too. So this poem is a portrait of the artist as a diviner. The diviner cut from the green hedge a forked hazel stick that he held tight by the arms of the V, circling the terrain, hunting the pluck of water, nervous but professionally unfussed. The pluck came sharp as a sting. The rod jerked down with precise convulsions, spring water suddenly broadcasting through a green hazel its secret stations. The bystanders would ask to have a try. He handed them the rod without a word. It lay dead in their grasp, till nonchalantly he gripped expectant wrists. The hazel stirred. In some metropolitan quarters in England, the following poem was regarded as a quaint nostalgia for dying crafts, which in part it is. But it's also a trust in the secret dark out of which any worthwhile writing arrives. It's called The Forge. And it's using the forge emblematically and not nostalgically, I think. Although nostalgia may give it some launch. This forge was a place I walked past on the way to school. You could hear the anvil ringing. You could see the sparks occurring. But it's a place that I never went into. This particular place I never entered. I went into other forges, but never this one. So it's about trusting, in a sense, in what occurs under the arches and rafters of the skull, as well as under the rafters of the forge. And it's another way of regarding the artist, perhaps, not as man of gift, but man of exercise of craft. It's a poem about, perhaps, about technique as merely receiving grid, as merely readiness. The forge. All I know is a door into the dark. Outside, old axles and iron hoops rusting. Inside, the hammered anvil's short-pitched ring, the unpredictable fantail of sparks, or hiss when a new shoe toughens in water. The anvil must be somewhere in the center, horned as a unicorn, at one end square, set there immovable. An altar where he expends himself in shape and music. Sometimes, leather-aproned, hairs in his nose, he leans out on the jam, recalls a clatter of hoofs where traffic is flashing in rows, then grunts and goes in with a slam and flick to beat rail iron out, to work the bellows. And the last of these emblematic or metaphoric tradesmen, craftsmen, figures that I'd like to read about is a figure known in social history and known in song and folk song as the servant boy or the hired boy. And this is a figure who walks about in the backyard of my head a lot. I have great affection for him, and eventually in the west coast of America got down to looking at him and bringing him up. The servant boy was a figure who was well known up until about 40 years ago. He was a kind of slave. There were these fairs, hiring fairs, once every quarter, and men, the servant boy could be 60 years of age. He was a boy. The important thing about a master or a colonizing or a masterful caste in any community is that it turns the natives into boys. And the servant boy, whether he was 14 or 60, was still a boy. I think of this guy moving about in the farmyards about 5:30 or 6 in the morning, possessing the terrain intimately, ministering to it, belonging to it, born out of it, paying into it, while master or mistress is still in bed. Maybe it's a poem about being a Catholic in Northern Ireland. Maybe it's a poem about being a writer reading on circuits. I don't know. Anyway, it's about a servant boy. He is wintering out the back end of a bad year, swinging a hurricane lamp through some outhouse, a jobber among shadows. Old work whore, slave blood, who stepped fair hills under each bidder's eye and kept your patience and your counsel, how you draw me into your trail broken from stackyard to stable, a straggle of fodder stiffened on snow, comes first footing the back doors of the little barons, resentful and impenitent, carrying the warm eggs. Next poem's out of the same terrain. It's much more a report and much more personal. It's called Follower. It's about father-son relationship. My father worked with a horse plough. His shoulders globed like a full sail strung between the shafts and the furrow. The horses strained at his clicking tongue. An expert, he would set the wing and fit the bright steel-pointed sock. The sod rolled over without breaking. At the head rig, with a single pluck of reins, the sweating team turned round and back into the land. His eye narrowed and angled at the ground, mapping the furrow exactly. I stumbled in his hobnailed wake, fell sometimes on the polished sod. Sometimes he rode me on his back, dipping and rising to his plod. I wanted to grow up and plough, to close one eye, stiffen my arm. All I ever did was follow in his broad shadow round the farm. I was a nuisance, tripping, falling, yapping always. But today, it is my father who keeps stumbling behind me and will not go away. Most of these poems began, as you can see, out of a recovery of childhood memories. And I didn't really write anything until I had started to teach, and until I think that drove me to it, in fact. But the origins and the germinating image was usually something that just appeared out of the past 20 years ago. And the next poem is one that Mr. McShane referred to, so I'd like to read it. It's about Blackberry Picking. It's a very pious poem, really, in that I think that a lot of this poetry is an exercise of piety of some kind, which is one of the strengths of our community and eventually becomes one of our furies. But the way in which the past seems to pursue, if not ensnare, Irish people is interesting. Anyway, this poem is just about blackberry picking, being a youngster picking blackberries. And perhaps also about learning to live with disappointment, which you almost forget that you learned to do. Late August, Given heavy rain and sun for a full week, the blackberries would ripen. At first, just one, a glossy purple clot, among others, red, green, hard as a knot. You ate the first one, and his flesh was sweet like thickened wine. Summer's blood was in it, leaving stains upon the tongue and lust for picking. Then red ones inked up, and that hunger sent us out with milk cans, pea tins, jam pots, where briars scratched and wet grass bleached our boots. Round hayfields, cornfields, and potato drills, we trekked and picked until the cans were full, until the tinkling bottom had been covered with green ones, and on top, big dark blobs burned like a plate of eyes. Our hands were peppered with thorn pricks, our palms sticky as bluebeards. We hoarded the fresh berries in the byre, but when the bath was filled, we found a fur, a rat-grey fungus glutting on our cache. The juice was stinking too. Once off the bush, the fruit fermented, the sweet flesh would turn sour. I always felt like crying. It wasn't fair that all the lovely canfuls smelt of rot. Each year I hoped they'd keep, knew they would not. This is about, this poem originated also. I'm not sure where it originated, but I know that what sired it and what mothered it. It's hard to know which is the origin in cases like that. One half of it, anyway, was just a word, Undine, 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 which is a poem itself, really. If I were Robert Bly, I would just say it over and over to you. And it would work. Undine. Undine. But also when I looked it up, I didn't look it up in the dictionary, thanks be to God. I was looking for another word, and I discovered this word as accident. And it meant a water nymph who has to marry a human being and have a child by him before she can get a soul, before she can become a human. So, something resonant about the definition of the resonant sound, and it married, and unexpectedly, an image of a man just digging a drain or cleaning out drains in a remote terrain in County Derry. So the poem became about water, or woman, or Undine, or digging drains, or whatever you want to say. And in the poem, water, woman, or whoever speaks. Undine. He slashed the briars, shoveled up grey silt to give me right of way in my own drains, and I ran quick for him, cleaned out my rust. He halted, saw me finally disrobed, running clear with apparent unconcern. Then he walked by me. I rippled and I churned where ditches intersected near the river until he dug a spade deep in my flank and took me to him. I swallowed his trench gratefully, dispersing myself for love down in his roots, climbing his brassy grain. But once he knew my welcome, I alone could give him subtle increase and reflection. He explored me so completely, each limb lost its cold freedom, human, warm to him. For some reason, I'm inclined to read a poem called Wedding Day after that. And I've often noticed that weddings in Ireland, it may be true in America, it may not be, that there are more tears at weddings. There are more shock, grief. There are more people genuinely surprised by the intensity of their feelings. It's a kind of possessiveness, perhaps, on the part of the parental family thing. But also, if someone very close to you is getting married, there's a quality of, I think, of hallucination almost, you can say. This poem is called Wedding Day. I am afraid. Sound has stopped in the day, and the images reel over and over. Why all those tears? The wild grief on his face outside the taxi. The sap of mourning rises in our waving guests. You sing behind the tall cake like a deserted bride who persists, demented, and goes through the ritual. When I went to the gents, there was a skewered heart and a legend of love. Let me sleep on your breast to the airport. This poem is out of the same terrain, the same kind of thing. It's called Mother of the Groom. What she remembers is his glistening back in the bath, his small boots in the ring of boots at her feet. Hands in her voided lap, she hears a daughter welcomed. It's as if he kicked when lifted and slipped her soapy hold. Once, soap would ease off the wedding ring that's bedded forever now in her clapping hand. This poem is called, it's also a short poem, called Home, simply. Bushing the door, my arms full of wild cherry and rhododendron, I hear her small lost weeping through the hall that bells and hoarsens on my name, my name. Oh, love, here is the blame. The loosened flowers between us gather in, compose for a May altar of sorts. These frank and falling blooms soon taint to a sweet chrism. Attend, anoint the wound. And this poem just takes a little private image. There's an image lodged in it that doesn't require comment, but it's as well to stop reading for a while anyway. Say so. We stayed in France for a month one time, and there were these caves close to us which had stalactites which were extraordinary. Perhaps all stalactites are like this, but they're the first ones that I had encountered. And if you tapped them, they would ring, would sing. And if you had been a kind of expert on the xylophone, you could have made the earth play for you. And so that's just to indicate that this takes place in France, and there are stalactites in the poem. And the poem has got a French title. It's called Au Bad. It's very short. Au Bad. My children weep out the hot foreign night. We walk the floor. My foul mouth takes it out on you, and we lie stiff till dawn attends the pillow and the maize and vine. Now, willful congress, opposed, spliced, and lapped. Rocks sang yesterday when we tapped stalactites in the great caves dripping dark. Our love calls tiny as a tuning fork. Next poem is based on a report in a newspaper in Ireland about 2 years ago, of an infant who was found in the salmon nets at Ballyshannon. Obviously an illegitimate child who had been ditched into the Shannon further up and had been eventually collected at the sea mouth. And the poem is called Limbo. Limbo is, as you know, an inhumane theological notion that the souls of the unbaptized or reside in a kind of perpetual free fall. They can't go one place or another. And it's just about the state of limbo in a society perhaps that forces a girl to ditch the love child into the water rather than bring him out and show him. It's a poem dedicated to all those Irish girls who go to London for abortions. Fishermen at Ballyshannon netted an infant last night along with the salmon, an illegitimate spawning, a small one thrown back to the waters. But I'm sure as she stood in the shallows, ducking him tenderly, till the frozen knobs of her wrists were dead as the gravel, he was a minnow with hooks tearing her open. She waded in under the sign of her cross. He was hauled in with the fish. Now, limbo will be a cold glitter of souls through some far briny zone. Even Christ's palms, unhealed, smart, and cannot fish there. I read about 5 more poems. This poem is about lying awake in Belfast while the fire raisers are at it, or while the fires are going up. It's always an interesting position for the liberal to lie in his bed and hear people killing one another half a mile away, especially if he is on the point of leaving the country to come to America, especially if he knows inside out why people are killing one another, especially if he knows he could blame himself as much as anybody else. This poem's all twisted, and I'm sure it's not resolved, but it comes out of those kind of twists. There's an image of the mandrake, which was this magnificent plant which screamed like a man when it was uplifted. Remember, you had to bring a black dog with you at midnight and encircle the plant 3 times with female blood. And when you brought it up, it screamed and the dog died. It usually grew at places where men were hanged. And when men are hanged, well, anyway. This poem is just about uprooting and screaming and all that at once. It's called Nocturne. Leaf membranes lid the window. In our street lamp's glow, your bodies moonstruck to drifted barrow, sunk glacial rock. Sleeping beauty, the touch of love, operative as faith to move your small mountains and shift your gradual plains, is stilled. Above each slated terrace, gunshot and siren dwindle towards us like well-timed noises off. The fault is opening at last. My love, how should we love our old Gomorrah? We petrify or uproot now. I'll dream it for us before dawn, when the pale sniper steps down and I approach the shrub. I've soaked by moonlight in tidal blood a mandrake, lodged human fork, earth sack, limb of the dark, and I wound its damp, smelly loam and stop my ears against the scream. This poem is a curious poem which is based on a dream of a wounded man falling into our bathroom. And it seemed to me like a reproach or a reminder to the bourgeoisie in Belfast, really, not to sit in their backsides and blame it on the ghettos, that sooner or later it was all going to come into the houses to them. So this is a curious, odd, kind of dramatic monologue, which is called A Thomas in the Wilderness. Thomas, as you know, couldn't believe things until he put his hands into the very wound. And it's perhaps also about the notion that wounds have to be broken right and healed right. In the north of Ireland, and in Ireland generally, for I suppose 800 years, wounds have been broken and half healed. and half healed and half broken and half healed, and tremendous head of pus going now in the northern top. A Thomas in the wilderness, this is called. Once the wounded began staggering into our bathrooms, obstinate and undeniable, loading themselves behind shower curtains, groaning into the scarred basin, we deserted and ran from their mouths fierce awning, those palms like streaming webs. From the hills we watched our town like an ulcer scalding. Young and old at peepholes and stone ditches, or laid on their bellies to part the rushes. Now we starve on the crater's rim. Must I crawl back, a spirochete abroad between shred-hung wire and thorn, to confront my smeared doorstep and what lumpy dead? Why do I unceasingly arrive late to condone infected sutures and ill-knit bone? I would like to read a poem called Bogland, which is about Bogland, which is a typical landscape of ours. And one of the things that Old Men is a place where they dig out peat, which is kind of fiery. And one of the things men used to say to us, old people used to say, to keep us away from these holes where the peat had been dug out, which were full of water. Instead of saying banally, you'll drown if you go there, they said, don't be going near those holes, there's no bottom in them. And also, one of the geography lessons which were always taught in the primary school in Ireland was that Ireland was like a saucer, that it had a high rim and a low bottom. And it's also a kind of typical thing that in any other country, what would be called the Central Plain or the Midland region is called in Ireland the Bog of Allen. And it's very soft, inviting centre. And bogs, as you know, have this fantastic power of preserving things. Preserve human flesh, preserve butter, preserve everything that falls into them, if it falls in the right place. And in a way I try to use the bog as an emblem or symbol of our consciousness, which can preserve the past so present. Stephen Dedalus, in The Portrait of the Artist, said that history was a nightmare from which he was trying to awake. This is an attempt to say that history is a bog from which we will never slither out. You know, keeps inviting us in, and it opposes the prairie, which is one kind of mythic outward bound landscape, to the bogland. We have no prairies to slice a big sun at evening. Everywhere the eye concedes to encroaching horizon is wooed into the cyclops eye of a tarn. Our unfenced country is bog that keeps crusting between the sights of the sun. They've taken the skeleton of the great Irish elk out of the peat, set it up an astounding crate full of air. Butter sunk under more than 100 years was recovered salty and white. The ground itself is kind black butter, melting and opening underfoot, missing its last definition by millions of years. They'll never dig coal here. Only the waterlogged trunks of great firs, soft as pulp. Our pioneers keep striking inwards and downwards. Every layer they strip seems camped on before. The bog holes might be Atlantic seepage. The wet centre is bottomless. Finally, I'd like to read a poem which is about one of the finds that were made in a bog. Not in Ireland, but in Jutland, at a place called Tollund. The Tollund Man was one of the first finds. They discovered this guy, naked and perfect, in a bog with a little skin cap on his head and a little noose on his neck, which made them sent to the barracks. And then the barracks made them sent to the museum. And eventually it all came out that this man was the bridegroom of the spring goddess who had been sunk in her delicious welcome in the bog about 2,000 years ago. And she had kept him there. The bog, this little bog, this cauldron bog, had been her sacred grove. And this man, this Tollund Man, this man from the parish of Tollund, had been taken round on a tumbril as the bridegroom of the goddess and had been wed to her in her regent so that the year would be renewed, so that life would come back, so that the spring would return. I saw about this in a book which had a lot of photographs of these heads and bodies. Eventually a number of these bodies were discovered, all preserved. And the Tollund Man's head is at Aarhus in Jutland, Denmark, still. But they began to tie up in my head with photographs I'd seen in histories of the Irish Civil War of atrocities, Civil War atrocities, of killings in people's own backyards, of families who had mutilated one another. There are these pathetic photographs in the Civil War records of families, men of families taken out of their beds at 6 o'clock in the morning and shot in their own street with big moving feet sticking up into the camera, one sock on and the other sock off, and their shirt tail hanging out and blood across their mouth. And it also tied up with, out of the very district where I came from, there were these stories of mutilations of a family of men who were pulled out and trailed along the railroad, 4 of them, after a buggy. And in a way, these chaps who were killed in the Irish Civil War and who are perhaps killing one another now, it just happens to be that there are 53 people killed in the last 3 years in Belfast, I read yesterday. They're killed casually now and again, innocent enough people, killing one another, in the hope of renewal, in a way. So these guys, these victims, connected with the Tollund Man, and this poem, which is the last poem I read, is just a kind of prayer of sorts that his germination may bring about the germination of these other innocent, sacrificed country people. The Tollund Man. Someday I will go to Aarhus to see his peat-brown head, the mild pods of his eyelids, his pointed skin cap. In the flat country nearby where they dug him out, his last gruel of winter seeds caked in his stomach, naked except for the cap, noose, and girdle, I will stand a long time. Bridegroom to the goddess, she tightened her torque on him and opened her fen, those dark juices working him to a saint's kept body, trove of the turf cutter's honeycombed workings. Now his stained face reposes at Aarhus. I could risk blasphemy, consecrate the cauldron bog our holy ground, and pray him to make germinate the scattered, ambushed flesh of labourers, stockinged corpses laid out in the farmyards, telltale skin and teeth flecking the sleepers of 4 young brothers trailed for miles along the lines. Something of his sad freedom as he rode the tumbril should come to me driving, saying the names Tollund, Graball, Nabilgard, watching the pointing hands of country people, not knowing their tongue. Out there in Jutland, in the old man-killing parishes, I will feel lost, unhappy, and at home.
Thanks for listening. 92nd Street Y, Unterberg Poetry Center webcasts, and access to our archive are made possible by the generous support of listeners like you. For more information on 92nd Street Y and all our programs, please visit us on the web at 92y.org. This program is copyright 1971 by 92nd Street Y.